Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI.
As the Israel Defense Forces further ramp up their military campaign against Hamas, activists and aid workers warn that the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is again reaching catastrophic proportions. Why have these conditions intensified so sharply? What is the Israeli military hoping to achieve? What reverberations have the past several months of worsening hostilities in Gaza caused, both inside Israel and abroad? And what could be the endgame for the conflict? To discuss these questions and more, this week we welcome to the program Ghaith al-Omari. Ghaith is a senior fellow in the Washington Institute and the former executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine and a former advisor to the Palestinian Authority.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please check out MEI's other podcasts, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Ganul Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Ghaith, welcome to the podcast, and thank you very much for joining us.
All right, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure.
It's great to have you here with us. Let's dive right in. And to start off with, can you paint a picture for our listeners of what the situation in Gaza is like right now, roughly 2.5 months after the Israeli resumption of its military campaign and nearly 600 days on from the start of the war?
All right, thank you. I mean, let me start maybe with a caveat. It's very hard to get accurate information from the ground, and more so because there are so many different actors who have an interest in spinning the reality in ways that advance their agendas. So take what I'm going to say with a grain of salt, but frankly, take anything that you read with a grain of salt. I would say what we are seeing right now is, there are different levels. On the humanitarian level, we see a really unconscionable situation. I'm not going to go into, is it famine? Is it mass starvation? All of these issues. I think sometimes we get too distracted and waylaid by these details. The reality is life right now for most Palestinians in Gaza is hell. Whether because of the resumed hostilities, whether because of the constant evacuation orders that are causing mass displacement, or because of the lack of sufficient humanitarian, whether food or medicine, etc. So that's kind of the humanitarian. And then I'm sure we'll talk more about the political implications. On the military front, we are seeing progressively more and more Israeli control over territories. Now, interestingly, though, it's happening much slower than predicted. Partly because it's not clear how serious the Israeli government is with reoccupying Gaza. Partly because I think the IDF itself is slow walking some of these political instructions. And partly because, frankly, so many Israeli reservists are just not reporting to the military. But it's ongoing. For Hamas, interestingly, Hamas has not been showing much of resistance right now. Maybe a few, commando operations here and there, but there has not been organized resistance yet. Everyone's waiting to see when Israel goes into the dense urban areas, how that's going to play out. But definitely we see a hot conflict. Finally, I would say the mechanism that Israel and the United States produced or created for delivering aid has unsurprisingly been struggling, beset with problems and with setbacks, and it's not very clear how sustainable it is.
I wanted to follow up and ask specifically about that new mechanism, which is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which operates under a sort of U.S.-Israeli aegis. How did that kind of come about, and what do we see from its performance so far?
It came about because Israel, and for understandable reason, is quite, let's say, uncomfortable with the international aid system, be it the UN system or the non-governmental aid organizations. Israel perceives these organizations as too critical, as too biased, too one-sided, etc. And there's a built-in, I think, suspicion of the international community in general, in Israel after October 7th, and particularly in this government. So Israel wanted to create an organization that will bypass the two major objections it has to international aid systems. One, the political criticism of Israel. So it tried to create a completely non-political organization, and to also prevent the diversion of aid into Hamas and Hamas supporters. In theory, this sounds good. In reality, though, it's very complicated. It's complicated because this organization was immediately boycotted by most of the international community, including the donor community, because it was perceived as not adhering to international standards of neutrality, impartiality, etc. I mean, there are very specific and technical concepts in international laws of war in terms of this. Particularly, there was concern that this organization might end up facilitate the forced displacement of Palestinians, something that no one in the international community is willing to support. So Israel and the U.S. went alone on this one, even though, interestingly, the U.S. Tries to kind of distance itself from this, and it's becoming more and more an Israeli organization. Now, it faced some expected challenges. These challenges relate to basically the scale of the crisis. When you have 3, 4, 5 distribution centers, that's hardly enough. When you look at the amount of aid coming in, that's hardly enough. But also because it's seen as not adhering to some of these international standards, it has, as I mentioned, boycotted by the international community, but also some of the people who work in the organization basically started walking out of it. The executive director quit just a day or two before it started. We're hearing now of some of the consultancies that are working with it, basically pulling back. And it's also been, frankly, beset by violence. Because of the scarcity of the aid, because of the situation in Gaza, many of the civilians basically are so desperate that we've been seeing stampedes. We've been seeing acts of shooting, whether it's, this is one of the issues that are contested. Yet the reality is this has not been a safe and secure way of delivering aid.
Just following up on that, as you mentioned, one of the two kind of objectives in setting this up was to address the kind of perception by Israel that there was distribution issues around theft or diversion of aid by Hamas or other armed groups. How real is that threat, and do you think this has been effective in addressing that at all?
First of all, I mean, the threat is real. I mean, this is a fact. We've seen footage of Hamas operatives going and stealing aid. We hear anecdotal stories from people in Gaza, etc. Though I have to say this is not a purely, Gaza problem. In many armed conflicts, it's a given that some of the aid will be diverted. But I think in this case, Hamas went beyond what is expected. Whether or not this is successful is really questionable. It's questionable because, first of all, the mechanism used to ascertain who gets the aid is flawed. What defines who's a Hamas member, who's not a Hamas member? Who do you get your list from? And we have seen actually on the ground that because of the pressure, because of the demand, because just of the sheer numbers of people who want aid, we hear that the officials of the mechanism basically are no longer even checking the names against the lists. But the bigger problem is that while you can ensure that at the point of distribution, you can have some checks ensuring that Hamas members will come in, etc. Once they leave this parameter, then it's anyone's guess who gets the aid. And Hamas has not been known, let's say, to be the most charitable organization when it comes to its own population. And we do hear of cases where Hamas is stealing some of the aid from the people after they leave the parameters. So it seems insufficient in addressing this challenge.
A specific charge that has been made is that the GHF, this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, is either being used by or it's actively assisting the Israel Defense Forces to achieve their military objectives on the ground. How would you evaluate those claims?
Very hard to evaluate those claims. I mean, on the one hand, I understand the motivation for having this. At the end of the day, if you're a humanitarian, you want food to get to the people. The politics is tomorrow's problem. For many of these organizations, so I understand where it's coming from. Yet the reality is, because of the scarcity of the aid, because of the limited distribution centers, because they're all basically focused in the south of the Gaza Strip, they seem to kind of correspond to the Israeli objective of moving the population. It's not helped by the fact that Israeli officials, including cabinet ministers, have been very clear in saying the whole objective of this is to create depopulation. They call it implementing the Trump plan. So I think there is enough suspicion there. This is not to say that the individuals who are engaged in it are doing it maliciously. Again, many are doing it for the right reasons. Yet there is enough concern that there's a shadow of a doubt, let's say, when it on its activities.
Do we think that this GHF experiment has kind of run its course? Is there any sign that we may be coming back to the system that was in place beforehand?
Again, with the big caveat that who knows, the reality on the ground keeps evolving, but we are seeing fraying in the structures that are in place. We're seeing, as mentioned earlier, staff leaving, partner organizations leaving. But most importantly, if you look at the proposal presented by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff for a ceasefire, one of the clauses talks about distribution of aid being undertaken by the UN and international NGOs. I think there's an understanding that this simply does not fill the void that is there. The fact that this was included in an American proposal tells you that the US does not seem to be fully invested in this and might consider it to be insufficient. How that's going to play out obviously will remains to be seen, because the Witkoff proposal is yet to become a reality.
Let's shift gears a little bit now. Turning to the Israeli military campaign in Gaza, what is the IDF trying to achieve and in what time frame?
This is again where you see, I think, a degree of tension between the IDF and the Israeli political echelon. Formally at least, the objective of this operation, there are four objectives: to release hostages, to ensure that Hamas does not have the capabilities to govern Gaza and be a threat to Israel, and finally, and this is a new introduction, to implement President Trump's plan, which, by the way, there is no formal plan. Often it's seen as code for displacement of the population. Each one of those objectives is contested. Is contested even within Israeli debate. And I think the most contested issue within Israel, at least, is whether or not military means actually will produce a release of the hostages. What we have seen so far is the vast majority of the hostages have been released out of deals, not out of military action. And what you hear from the testimonies of some of these hostages, that actually military operations, rather than facilitating the release, are actually worsen their own conditions. So that's questionable. When it comes to defeating Hamas as well, for all intents and purposes, Hamas is defeated as a military. And there is a real concern. You hear it from IDF officers that you talk to off the record. There's a concern that continuing this operation and going specifically if you go into holding territory for a period of time, this might actually breathe new life into Hamas and turn it from and allow it to kind of become an insurgency, and an appealing insurgency for that matter. And finally, I think at the kind of higher politics of it, there is concern within the many Israelis that this is just cover for reoccupying Gaza and reestablishing settlements in Gaza. I mean, the Gaza disengagement when Israel left Gaza in 2005 was controversial at the time, but right now has become an accepted reality in Israel. And there is concern in general that the plans might reintroduce a reoccupation of Gaza, and this particular concern in the IDF, because the reoccupation of Gaza, in addition to the reputational and security risks, would basically entail such an expenditure of resources, manpower, money, etc., that might pin the IDF down and might basically distract it from other priorities, be it what's happening in the West Bank, be it Iran, be it all of these things. So all of these things are there, but they're not really, there is no consensus in Israel in terms of pursuing these agenda, and we see this almost daily within Israeli politics.
Yeah, you've certainly touched on many aspects of this already, the domestic Israeli reception to what's happening there. There has been growing opposition to this continuation of the military campaign from key Israeli politicians and public figures. We have one notable example, the 27th of May op-ed from former Prime Minister Olmert in Haaretz. In it, he wrote that the government was, quote, waging a war without purpose, without goals or clear planning, and with no chances of success. But where do you see broader Israeli society on this question?
I think by and large, Israeli society is, I wouldn't say unanimous, but the overwhelming majority want the release of the hostages by whatever means necessary. I believe that right now the schism that we see in Israel is whether or not military means are effective in releasing the hostages. So far, I think the majority, and we're starting to see that the majority of Israelis just simply don't see this to be the case. I don't think there is an inherent opposition to the war. I think the anger after October 7th, fully understandable, continues to kind of be overwhelming in Israel. I mean, it's worth noting that if you go to Israel, if you watch Israeli media, Israel, in many ways, is still living on October 8th. I think the trauma has not yet been processed, let alone healed. Yet, the main question in Israel right now is whether or not the military operation will cause the release of hostages. And most Israelis, according to opinion polls, simply don't believe that that's the case. And that's why you see such overwhelming support for all of the different ceasefire proposals that are coming. Yet, of course, does it translate into real political pressure? So far, it hasn't. Partly because the prime minister's own base continues to be more favorable to the war, partly because the ruling coalition itself, even though not reflective of public opinion, nevertheless overwhelmingly supports it. But certainly, you're starting to see more and more discomfort with the war, particularly, again, the question of are military means a way of reaching it? By the way, this is not very different from what we had in this country regarding the Iraq war, the Afghanistan war, which at some point the public is asking, is this the right way to go about it? And I think this is what we're seeing in Israel, but that's a developing story.
On the international front, we've seen kind of growing opposition from increasingly even longtime allies over the renewed military campaign in Gaza. The UK, France, and Canada put out a joint statement recently decrying Israel's, quote, egregious escalation. We've seen moves from the UK on suspending negotiations on a free trade deal. France has said it may impose sanctions on some extremist settlers, and the new German chancellor has been quite vocal in his kind of concerns about the impact on civilians in particular. How significant is this sort of broader shift, and what impact do you think it's having on the Israeli government?
It certainly is significant, particularly, as you mentioned, coming from long time allies of Israel. I mean, Germany, this is almost unheard of, that Germany comes out with this kind of the tone that the chancellor and the foreign minister came with. And I think this is due to two things. This is due partly because of the human toll, but more importantly, perhaps, because the human toll is not new. What's more important is, I think, there is basically no understanding in the international community of what is Israel trying to do. I mean, there was a lot of support for Israel in the initial phases of the war, until I think the beginning of the year. Even though the human toll was high, but there was an understanding that the Israeli objective of destroying and disarming Hamas and releasing the hostages was both worthwhile and realistic. Right now, there's simply no understanding. And what they see is basically all of these casualties without any meaning, as well as when you look at a couple of things that have crossed certain lines. The emphasis on displacing Palestinians is one that I think in most of the world is one that is just not supported. Similarly, the question of using aid as a way of exerting pressure. This is important. This is significant. It increases pressure. Yet, at the end of the day, Israel can withstand this. Israel can withstand it internally because I think, like any traumatized society, Israel basically cannot see beyond its trauma and can easily cast a lot of these statements as simply being anti-Israel statements. And partly because for Israel, the one relationship that matters most is the United States. And that relationship so far, even though we're seeing signs of impatience coming from the administration, there continues to be support for Israel. The Israeli leadership will start paying more attention if the U.S. starts moving on this issue.
Just following up on that one in particular, that question, what are you seeing on in terms of the changes on the U.S. front, and where do you see that going moving forward?
It's a complicated question because you need to zoom out a little bit. And to zoom out, basically, what we saw from President Trump's Middle East visit a couple of weeks ago is that this is a president who basically responds to two things. He's a president who does not like to be asked to do things. He likes to be given things. This is what happens when he went to Saudi, to Qatar, to the UAE. A lot of wins and with no demands, at least not public demands. And two, this is a president who likes to be told what he cannot do. Now, if you look at his relation with Netanyahu in particular, Netanyahu asks for things and tells him what he should not do, particularly when it comes to Iran. And that basically creates a degree of tension between the two leaders. But also, I think the president wants to present himself, well, I think genuinely, as a president who ends wars. This is clear. He campaigned on this. This is what his base likes. He said it many times, etc. And I think he's impatient. While he's not, he does not try to micromanage Israel in ways that we saw, for example, in the previous administration. Yet, I think when he said to the Israelis, go ahead and win the war, there was a limit on this. And right now, I believe that he just doesn't see where this is leading. Now, obviously, though, Hamas, unfortunately, keeps on inserting itself and giving an easy way out to the Israeli government. When Hamas rejects the American ceasefire proposal, then it becomes very convincing when the Israeli side says, it's not us, it's them. So far, there is tension, there is displeasure, yet we have not seen it turn into real pressure because Hamas has been creating the off-ramp.
On this question of the latest ceasefire and hostage release deal from Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, what's within this latest package and how have the two sides been responding?
It's not very different from previous packages. What it basically talks about is the release of a number of hostages, both dead and alive, in two phases, on the first day and I think on the seventh day. In return, Israel will release some Palestinian prisoners, will allow the resumption of aid, and will have a ceasefire for 60 days. This is kind of the easy part. However, it still has not addressed and has not managed to square the impossible circle of the two incompatible Israeli and Hamas objectives. Israel wants to have the freedom to achieve all of its war objectives. That means the destruction of Hamas and the right to continue the war. Hamas wants any deal to have very clear ironclad guarantees that the war will be over. And of course, this is almost impossible to reconcile. So we see attempts to basically use language to massage it. They talk about negotiations with the objective of reaching an end of the war. They talk about guarantees by the president himself that the negotiations will be genuine. Yet all of these things at the end of the day are words. And I think fundamentally, unfortunately, Hamas believes that time is on its side. And Netanyahu believes the time is on his side. And when the two warring parties believe that time is on their side, it's very hard to see how a deal can be struck.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what's happening around this deal in the international community, specifically the Saudi and French decision to hold a conference on a political resolution of the Gaza crisis.
It actually goes beyond the gas crisis. And I think one of the things that have been worrying diplomats in the region, in Europe, etc., is that while there's a lot of focus on Gaza, and rightly so, I mean, it's the nature of the conflict is such that it has to be a priority. Yet there has been concern on two things: what's happening in the West Bank, and more broadly, the prospects of reaching a two-state solution. If you look at what's happening in the West Bank, the reality is the security situation is extremely precarious, but also the political situation is precarious. When Israel announces the establishment of 22 new settlements, if I'm not mistaken, the biggest such announcement since the Oslo agreements. If you see Israeli officials, including the defense minister and the finance minister, saying the explicit objective of these steps is to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. When you see moves that's happened in Jerusalem that create tensions in Jerusalem, whether it is in terms of threatening what we call the status quo in the holy sites, etc. This has created concern among diplomats that we might see an end of the prospects of a two-state solution. And no one's naive. No one thinks a two-state solution can happen today, tomorrow, in a week, or in a year. However, they want to preserve the possibility of a two-state solution because they see no other solution. This is the kind of organizing principle internationally when it comes to approaching this conflict. This is what motivated Saudi Arabia and France to call for this meeting. The idea was not new. The idea has been being kicked around for a couple of years. It became formalized last year in the United Nations, and the conference is going to happen mid-June, I think on the 17th. What is not clear is what is the objective. You know, the objective is clear, but what does it actually mean in concrete terms? When you talk to Saudi and mainly to French diplomats, they will tell you they do not want this to be only about recognition of a Palestinian state. Many diplomats just don't see the point of recognition. What's another recognition? How is that going to change reality? The Saudis are more gung-ho on the issue of recognition. How do you kind of balance this out? This is not clear. While there is clearly, for example, steps that Israel has to do, and I'm sure the final communique will relate to these, but there are steps that Palestinians will have to do. I think there's an understanding today, if a Palestinian state was created today, tomorrow, it will be a failed state because the Palestinian Authority is so useless, discredited, lacks capability, seen as corrupt, etc., etc. So it's not clear if this is just going to be another statement or if there's going to be real action that will work on enabling the Palestinian Authority. Then there is a concern of what do you do if Israel decides to retaliate? We're already hearing statements from Israeli officials saying that if this happens, then Israel will retaliate through more settlements and more land grabs. Is France and Saudi Arabia, are they capable of basically withstanding the inevitable pressure that will come in the days, before the conference, coming from Washington and elsewhere on different countries to basically send lower level representatives? I mean, all of these questions that might sound very in the weeds and kind of very diplomatic, but ultimately that's what defines the success or failure of this. I think a big question right now is what is the U.S. Planning to do about this? Because while we do have very clear U.S. policy when it comes to Gaza, and you see it through Witkoff, we do not have a policy when it comes to the larger Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And if we don't have a policy, then it's not very clear whether we're going to just have a knee-jerk reaction to this conference. Will we have a more systematic reaction to it? What's the center of gravity? Is it come from the White House, from U.S. The United Nations, etc.? I mean, all of these may be Washington questions, but ultimately, if they are not addressed, then there's a risk of drift in the U.S. approach to this.
Any sense on whether the U.S. will, in fact, send any high-level officials to
Oh, no, the U.S. will definitely not send high-level officials. I mean, that's a given. The question is, will the U.S. proactively work to undermine this, or will the U.S. basically step back and let it take its course? And my sense is that this is a question that has not been resolved yet in the administration.
I wanted to turn, and you touched on this a little bit before, but wanted to drill down in a little bit more detail, is the situation in the West Bank. You touched on the kind of expansion of settlement activity, the largest since Oslo, but I feel like that side of the equation has gotten much less attention here in the media and in Washington in general. There are other kind of noteworthy or important developments that you think are worth highlighting there?
For sure. I mean, in addition to settlement expansion, what we are seeing is an expansion of settler violence. This is not a new phenomenon. This has been going on for years. The difference right now, there are two differences. One is a difference of scale. It's just happening much, much more. Not a day passes on without reading some report here or there about an attack. But it's also noteworthy that it has not been addressed in any meaningful way by Israeli authorities. I mean, in the past, at least you could argue that there were tensions between the police that did not want Israel that want to enforce versus the IDF that wanted to enforce, etc. Today, you see basically almost complete impunity. And this impunity is emboldening some of these attacks. So that's one thing to keep an eye on. Partly because just it's unconscionable, but partly because with every settler attack holds the potential of triggering widespread security instability, given how tense things are. So that's kind of one thing. Another one is an ongoing Israeli military operation targeting particularly refugee camps in the northern West Bank. And again, on the one hand, this is understandable. A lot of these refugee camps and some of these towns have been a hotbed of planned terror attacks against Israel, and the Palestinian Authority has not done enough to have security control. Yet, the nature of these military operations has been causing mass displacement. Numbers that I have seen around 40,000 of that. We're seeing full destruction of property. We're seeing some of the methodology used in Gaza being brought into that. So that's another thing to kind of worry about, particularly if coupled with the stated objective by some Israeli ministers, not the cabinet, but some Israeli ministers, of annexation, etc. So that's another thing. What's happening in Jerusalem is also concerning. And what we're seeing, there's something called the status quo. It's a system that has been put together since the Ottoman period, so more than 100 years ago. Very vague, yet what we're seeing is an erosion of this, especially as it relates to Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount / the Haram al-Sharif. This is creating some major diplomatic tensions, certainly between Jordan and Israel, the two countries that cooperate on a security level on these issues, yet politically seem to be at loggerheads. And at some points, the politics might overshadow the security cooperation. But most interestingly, recently, it's also creating tension between Israel and its closest Arab ally. and that's the United Arab Emirates. In recent days, we saw Abu Dhabi summoning the Israeli ambassador and basically for a dressing down. This is notable. This is notable because this is, I believe, only the second time it happened, and I believe the first time since the Gaza war. It's notable because the United Arab Emirates has been almost unique, I would say, in terms of clearly and methodically and publicly saying that they will continue the relation with Israel despite the war. So we're seeing these developments in Jerusalem raising contact problems with Arab countries. And finally, I would say, look, if there has been, at least conceptually, one potential positive development that will come in coming months and years, it would be the possibility of Saudi-Israeli normalization. These steps are endangering this. If Saudi is convinced that Israeli action in the West Bank and in Jerusalem will preclude the possibility of a two-state solution, then the idea of Saudi-Israel normalization will be shelved indefinitely. So not only is this impacting existing relationships, it's impacting potential relationships. And we saw it recently when the Saudis wanted to basically send a very interesting message. They wanted to send their foreign minister, leading an Arab foreign minister delegation, to go to Ramallah to meet with President Mahmoud Abbas of the PA. Now, what is not reported is the fact to go to Ramallah, you need to get Israeli permission. And this will be the first time that a senior Saudi official would ask for Israeli permission. It was seen by some as maybe even a tacit recognition of the Israeli role. Israel decided to ban and to stop this trip. This created a huge amount of ill will from Saudi vis-a-vis Israel and will probably harden the Saudi position moving towards the June conference in New York.
I wanted to ask you about that specifically. Why do you think Israel did that? And what does that kind of tell us about the state of its relations with its Arab neighbors more broadly?
Well, first of all, I think it tells us a state of the mindset in Israel. I think it's a very beleaguered mindset. I think after October 7th, Israel sees more threat than opportunity. And again, it's understandable, seeing the nature of the trauma. And I want to maybe drill a bit on this point because it's easy from Washington to look at this in abstract terms and kind of, international relation terms. The reality for Israel, this is real. This is a trauma and the Israelis are still reeling from it. Yet it tells you there is a beleaguered sense. But also, I think it tells you a lot about Israeli domestic politics. I suspect ultimately Prime Minister Netanyahu, who made this decision, and it's not the foreign minister, this is something that's made the Prime Minister. He did not only look, or not even primarily look, at the foreign policy and diplomatic implications of this. He looked at the domestic implications, and he knew that allowing this will bring upon him a lot of criticism, including from some of his coalition members. So basically, as they say, all politics is local, and more so in Israel than many other places. So we see here Israeli domestic politics actually causing, I think, serious harm to some potential diplomatic benefits that Israel and the region will accrue from basically moving forward with the normalization with Arab countries.
That's all the time we have for this week. Ghaith, thank you very much for joining us on the program today. As always, we want to thank our listeners for tuning in and our production team for all of their work on this week's episode. To find MEI's latest coverage of Israel, Palestine, and the war in Gaza, please visit our website, www.mei.edu. And you can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you listen in again next week.